Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. We'll be exploring today reincarnation in ancient societies. With me is anthropologist Dr. James Matlock, who is co-author with Erlander Haraldson of a book titled I Saw a Light and Came Here, Children's Experiences of Reincarnation. Dr. Matlock is also a regular contributor to the Psi Encyclopedia, the online Psi Encyclopedia, sponsored by the Society for Psychical Research in London. In addition, he has created a course on reincarnation called Signs of Reincarnation. I think it's the only academic course exclusively focusing in on research on reincarnation anywhere in the world. On top of that, he has authored dozens of academic papers and book chapters on the subject of reincarnation, anthropology, parapsychology, and related fields. Welcome, Jim.
Well, thanks, Jeff. I'm happy to be here.
I'm happy to be with you as well for our 10th interview.
Wow. 10 already.
Yes, we're covering a lot of ground, and I want to mention that to encourage our viewers to check the listings for the earlier ones in case they haven't caught them already. But now we're going to look at the ancient world, and I think most people probably assume, and we'll let them know that it's not an accurate assumption altogether, that reincarnation is a concept that came to us from Hindu culture.
That's right. And I don't know where this idea originated. That is the idea that reincarnation beliefs originated in India. But it's a very strong belief in academia. Mm-hmm. And if not India, academics have tended to want to place the origin of reincarnation beliefs in one place or another, and try to show that they diffused from there to the rest of the world, as if it was an idea that could have only appeared in one place. Mm-hmm.
Well, I suppose it's fair to say that the belief in reincarnation is strongest today in India.
Well, India would be one of the countries in which it's strongest. Certainly, all the countries that have religions like Hinduism, Buddhism, that include reincarnation would be counted that way. But there are others too. Mm-hmm. There are others, for instance, the Druze and Levi and other of the Shia Islamic heterodox Shia Islamic societies also include reincarnation as very strong among them too.
And reincarnation is an accepted belief amongst Orthodox Jews.
That's right. That's right. Mm-hmm. And there are questions of how old it is in Jewish culture. It may go back, to Greek and Roman times before. Mm-hmm.
It's very hard to say because
yeah.
Jewish culture has interacted with so many other ancient peoples in Babylon and Persia and Greece and Rome.
That's right. But we definitely find evidence of reincarnation beliefs and in early Judaism, but we don't know if it goes back to the tribes or not.
But really, one of the most significant examples of reincarnation belief in the ancient world would be the Pythagoreans.
That's right, and it entered Greece even before Pythagoras, but it became particularly prominent with Pythagoras, and he was very well known in the ancient world for having taught reincarnation or metempsychosis.
Now, how do you distinguish between metempsychosis and reincarnation? Are there differences?
Well, metempsychosis was the Greek word, one of the Greek words that was used for what we now call reincarnation.
Okay.
I do make an operative distinction between them in order to talk about different types of reincarnation belief. when I use the term reincarnation, I usually have in mind humans reincarnating as humans.
Yes.
And when I talk about metempsychosis, as opposed to reincarnation in a technical sense, I mean a belief that includes animal lives between human lives, or can.
Oh, okay.
So humans to animals to humans again. This cycle, which you find also in Hinduism and Buddhism, I refer to as metempsychosis.
Then another term we hear is transmigration.
And my operative definition of that is reincarnation of humans as animals, or across species lines more generally. So reincarnation, we can say, is rebirth in species lines. It doesn't have to be human to human. Right. It can be another animal to another member of that species. Metempsychosis, human, a cycle that involves more than one species, and but loops back, a cyclical cycle. And transmigration, simply a unidirectional rebirth across species lines.
Now, I know in Buddhism, which goes back a good 2,500 years, there are accounts that the Buddha remembered and told stories about many, many past lives, including past lives as a non-human.
That's right. Yes, he did. He claimed to remember well over 500 of his previous lives. And these stories form the corpus of Buddhist literature called the Jataka tales.
Jataka tales.
That's right. These Jataka tales are the Buddhist memories, ostensibly the Buddhist memories of his previous lives. And they include lives as humans and as a variety of animals. And
I'm under the impression that the stories that are attributed to the Buddha were probably transcribed by with the equivalent of scribes in his own day. He had monks around him. I don't think he left any writings of his own, but they recorded virtually everything he said.
Yes, but of course you didn't verify anything, so we don't, it's not equivalent to the cases that we have today.
He didn't employ the empirical method the way we do now.
That's correct.
But he did tell people, I'm sure of this, he told them, don't believe me just because I said it, check it out for yourself.
Well, yes, but check it out in an experiential way.
And through
not
meditation.
Try to verify it. And this is one way that the Pythagoreans differed from what you have in India, because Pythagoras himself he claimed to have remembered previous lives. He thought he could remember 4 lives, in fact, human lives. And perhaps animal lives too. One account of his previous lives says that he also recalled animal lives. And interestingly, with Pythagoras, he also claimed in one of these lives to have identified an object, a shield. The first life he recalled was of Phorbas, who was a warrior,
a figure in Homer,
a figure in the Iliad in particular, and he's killed by another character in the Iliad, Menelaus, but his shield was preserved in a temple. And Pythagoras, in his next life, Pythagoras remembering back, we don't have any independent documentation that in his next life, that he actually did this. But Pythagoras remembering back says that in his previous life, he recognized the shield of a Phorbas in a temple.
Now, I know we have pretty good records of the statements actually made by the Buddha. How are the records related to Pythagoras? How trustworthy are they?
Well, that's something of great debate. Pythagoras believed in oral teaching and didn't write anything down. So everything that's written down about Pythagoras was written down after his death, and sometimes well after his death. The longest biographies that we have and accounts we have of Pythagoras and his teachings of his school come sometimes centuries after his death.
Oh, I see, because he founded a school. You'd think there would be many people alive at the time of his death who were witnesses to his original teachings.
Well, yes, there would have been, but besides the oral transmission, he also believed in secrecy, and so it took a while for that sort of to break down, and so for people to begin to talk about what he taught. And for that reason, it's hard to know how trustworthy they are, because if things are written down centuries later, they may or may not accord with what he actually taught.
Of course.
So there are a lot of questions then about what exactly Pythagoras taught, but because it became so quickly known that he was teaching rebirth and metempsychosis, and more particularly, that's pretty much accepted. We do know that. That is established.
Well, I know, or I gather that the Pythagoreans were also vegetarians, and
this was consistent with him, because you see, he didn't want to eat because he believed that the animals could be could embody the
reborn
spirits
as
of
humans.
Right. He didn't want to. He wanted to abstain from
that
flesh.
makes sense.
It does, doesn't it? Yes.
But in the Hindu culture, where they also tend to be vegetarian, not exclusively.
Certain castes are more vegetarian than others. That's right.
Do you think that's in any way related to reincarnation beliefs?
Quite probably, yeah. Yeah, probably for the same reasons.
How interesting. Well, besides the Greeks and the Indians and Buddhists, Hindus and Buddhists, what other cultures are known to have had reincarnation beliefs?
Well, we talked a little bit about the Jewish culture.
Yes.
I mean, they're just, Josephus early on in the first century was writing about the Essenes. Josephus, I'm sorry, I keep mispronouncing that. Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure if my pronunciation is better, but that's the one I'm accustomed to.
Okay, so Josephus was writing in the first century about the beliefs of the Essenes. Am I pronouncing that right, or is it Essenes? I'm not sure. Okay. But the way he described it, it's not clear whether he was talking about reincarnation or perhaps just pre-existence. But he did mention what many people take to be reincarnation beliefs in the first century.
The pre-existence of the soul, as it's known in theology, is sort of a step in the direction of reincarnation.
That's right, yeah. And if Philo also, in the first century, was writing about Philo being a Jewish scholar.
Again, I would have pronounced it Philo, but I'm not necessarily. I don't know that my pronunciation is any better than yours,
right.
But I'm Philo Judaeus.
Okay, that from there, yeah. I've been advised that Philo is the correct pronunciation because that's the Greek. At any rate, he lived in Alexandria and wrote in Greek, so he was sort of he drew on his Jewish heritage as well as Greek culture and so forth. But anyway, he was writing in the first century, and that was more definite, definitely reincarnation. And then in later centuries, we find more and more until we get to the Kabbalah, and by the 13th century, where reincarnation becomes much more important in the Jewish tradition.
Well, now Philo, writing in the first century in Alexandria, I'm assuming would be in touch with the Neoplatonists.
He would have been, and the Neoplatonists. Well, we skipped all the way. We should say something about Greeks after Pythagoras until with Plato, and then we get to the Neoplatonists, shouldn't we? A follower and someone believed to have been a student of Pythagoras, Empedocles, also taught reincarnation and claimed to have had memories too, although his sound to me as if they may be more imaginary. He said he had been a boy and a girl, but also a bush, and a fish, a mute fish leaping out of the sea. He did write quite a lot, unlike Pythagoras, and his ideas were more elaborated. He elaborated much more about them, and about how he saw a reincarnation working. he believed that there could be up to 1,000 years between lives, during which time the spirit went to Hades, which is an old tradition going back to America times of the past life spent in Hades. But during the time in Hades, the spirit would work off any baggage that he carried forward.
Doing penance of
doing
some sort.
penance. That's right. It was judged and it was doing penance for its sins before being reborn.
Very different than the idea of karma.
Very different from the Indic idea of karma. That's right. And there was also during this same time period a poet called Pindar who wrote odes, that is, poems to honor people or commemorate events and things. And he wrote, we don't know how many odes he wrote that included reincarnation. We only have 2 that have come down to us that do speak to reincarnation. But the system he described was different from the one that Pythagoreans described, in that he seemed to suggest that rebirth occurred relatively quickly. Only after a few years, but that after in one of his odes, he says after 3 incarnations, if a person doesn't violate, the norms of Greek society, one could advance out of the reincarnation cycle and go live on the island of the blessed with the gods, which is where the gods were believed to live. So you have the idea here of graduating out of the reincarnation cycle, but going to live with the gods, not as in Hinduism, Buddhism, simply graduating into nirvana after your karma is extinguished.
Well, in an earlier interview when we talked about reincarnation in tribal societies, you emphasized the work of Tyler, who collected a lot of data on reincarnation and animistic beliefs in tribal cultures, and concluded that these beliefs were based on empirical observations, looking for the signs of reincarnation, much the way you and your anthropology work and reincarnation researchers do today.
Right.
Would you say that the ancient cultures, the Greeks and the Hindus and the Buddhists, also engaged in empirical observations of this type?
Much less so. Of course, with Pythagoras, we do see that. Pythagoras does claim to have had the memories. He claims to have made that identification. So he seemed to be aware, at least. But in general, no. And this is important because as we're moving away from the tribal substrate here, where the belief in reincarnation is supposed to be based on the empirical experiences and observations, we have and was limited to conclusions drawn directly from this empirical data. We have sort of a movement to begin thinking about reincarnation in more philosophical terms, and so it becomes elaborated in many, many different ways.
So it's likely, though, that these ancient peoples also had contact with indigenous cultures around them.
Yes, they would have had.
So their reincarnation beliefs could be, to some extent, an elaboration of folk beliefs of indigenous people.
To a certain extent, we see the most evidence of contact with indigenous peoples in India. In fact, the Indian beliefs in reincarnation appear to have emerged with contact, at the time of contact, with tribal beliefs in India.
In particular, I think you mentioned the Dravidians.
The Dravidian tribes of northern India. And in fact, in India, I mean, we tend to think about, India. There have been so many cases of reincarnation reported from India that we don't, many people don't realize that the great majority of them are reported from only a few areas of India, and particularly northern India, which is precisely the area that we're talking about here. where the Aryans first entered India after having spent some time in help me out here.
Caucasus,
Persia. The Indus Valley civilization, which is a little bit north. In the Indus Valley civilization was contemporaneous with ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia.
Right.
But was an important civilization already before the Aryans who were coming in from Eurasia got there.
Yes, indeed.
So the Aryans, who were interestingly enough, related to the ancestors of the Greeks.
Yes.
All the Indo-European peoples, came out of Central Asia or out of Ukraine is thought to be the homeland of Indo-European speakers. And from there, they moved both west and east. So the Greeks and the Romans and the Hindus, and also the Iranians
had common ancestors.
But at any rate, Indo-European, Proto-Indo-European culture, as far as we can tell, did not have reincarnation beliefs, but they developed later among many different Indo-European peoples. But anyway, with the it's interesting that we began to see reincarnation beliefs in the mentions of cases also coming in India, appearing in the Upanishads. The commentaries on the Vedas.
Of the kind that are studied today with children having specific memories.
Specific memories and mentions of birthmarks and announcing dreams and these sorts of things.
So we have accounts like that from ancient India.
Yes, we do. Although the belief in reincarnation in India seems to have arisen through contact with the Dravidian tribes. The idea of karma was not. Karma is not an animistic idea. It's not one you find in tribal societies.
Right.
It developed in India, in Hinduism and also in Buddhism, which began to arise around this same time, and Jainism. They all together developed the idea of karma.
Well, they all became very philosophically inclined.
And they became, this was an aspect of that.
Around 500 or BC or so, what's known as the Axial Age, the rise of the great religious theologies.
Right. And so the development of the idea of karma was part of that.
Yes.
So my point there is that karma is not it's not inherently part of reincarnation.
Right.
It's not intrinsically part of it.
In fact, we're going to do a separate conversation just on
karma, so we can leave that until then. But the important point is that yes, the contact with the tribes in India, what suggested the reincarnation idea to the Hindus, but then they added on to that. They elaborated in a very different way than the Greeks elaborated their ideas of reincarnation, because they didn't include karma. They had this idea that Empedocles articulated, and you also see in some others, of doing penance before rebirth. So you're working off your sins, as it were, before you're reborn.
Yes.
And you see this also in Plato.
It seems like an idea consistent with the Christian notion of purgatory.
Yes, it does. Well, it does, yes. Well, and then Christians, of course, after purgatory would send you either to heaven or hell, at least Catholics would.
Yeah.
But then Plato. We haven't gotten to Plato yet. Plato in his early dialogues didn't talk about reincarnation, but he made a visit out to Sicily and to southern Italy, which is where Pythagoras was. He wasn't in Greek proper; he was in Magna Graecia in southern Italy. But after a visit out there, began to write about reincarnation. And what he developed in his later dialogues were a lot of the ideas that he picked up then. But he did it through the words of his characters, so it's a little bit hazardous to say Plato, intended this or that, because he had allowed his characters, particularly Socrates, to talk about these things as a way of airing them and discussing them and elaborating them philosophically.
I mean, some people regard Plato as a journalist, just recording what other people said.
Well, I think like any good scholar, he drew on his predecessors, but then elaborated on them, and he brought in his own ideas. He developed them further. But yes, I mean, he did take definitely, from his predecessors.
Well, now you mentioned, though, the actual case of childhood memories being discussed in ancient India. To what extent do you suppose the ancient people did rely on empirical investigation?
Well, they may very well have. And we find these cases in China too, early China, from the first millennium. They may very well have, to a much greater extent than we realize. And they just didn't bother to write down these stories, and so very few have come down to us. But the point would be that they didn't stop there.
Yeah.
That gave them the basis for the idea of reincarnation, convinced them of its reality, but then they took the next step of beginning to imagine and how reincarnation occurred, what it meant, and then karma, and if you work off karma, you can graduate from the reincarnation cycle, and in Buddhism, merge back into nirvana. In Hinduism, you came out of the Godhead and you're moving back there.
Yeah.
Whereas with the Greeks, you may have started off with the gods. And Plato says at one point that souls were originally winged, and souls that lost their wings then incarnated on Earth, and it took 1,000 years to cycles took 10,000 years sometimes. There's cycles of 1,000, 10 cycles of 1,000 years for the souls then to regain their wings and rejoin the gods. Rejoin the gods, on the island of the blessed, like Empedocles said, not merge back into nirvana or the Godhead. So again, very different sort of elaboration, but again, elaboration on the idea, and not simply stopping with the empirical observation of reincarnation and then developing social practices to, like we talked about in our last conversation, to take advantage of it.
I gather that the Neoplatonists elaborated even further.
Yes, they continued to. And the later Neoplatonists began to say, well, human beings might not be able to reincarnate in, as I said, irrational animals, and vice versa. So they began to then talk about reincarnation in the sense that I'm talking about it, humans as humans, and saying you can't really have a reincarnation of a human being as an animal because mentally we're just too different. Yeah. And that idea originated with Porphyry and the later Neo-Pythagoreans.
And around the time that the Neoplatonic schools were closed, the Christianity began to become a stronger influence, and you had the rise of Gnosticism. And how did the Gnostics view reincarnation?
There were some of the Gnostic groups did embrace reincarnation. Not all of them, though. And it's more common for some reason in the Christian Gnostic groups than the Jewish Gnostic groups. I'm not sure quite why that would be. But the whole, the central idea of the Gnostic philosophy was knowing, of course, direct knowing.
Direct knowledge, yes.
And some of the Gnostics included direct knowledge of past lives and of reincarnational things, but not all of them.
I see. But at one point, I think it was the Council of Nicaea, the Christian church fathers determined to make it an official policy that reincarnation is antithetical to Christian theology.
Yeah, not only reincarnation, but pre-existence. which is something we really haven't talked about.
Yeah.
But during this period, throughout the Circum-Mediterranean area, all the way from Rome, all the way around to Egypt, to the Levant, reincarnation beliefs of one sort or another were quite common, very common. And we can deduce that both through direct sources. There were a lot of writers in the Roman period, Cicero, quite a few writers, Ovid, and so forth among the Romans, writing in Latin, who talked about reincarnation. But even earlier, in the first century, you had a number of church fathers, Christian church fathers, who were inveighing against it. People like Tertullian, who wrote a lot against reincarnation, and from which you can deduce that it must have been a fairly common belief among many people. Otherwise, they wouldn't have wasted so much time and energy to argue against it. But we don't really know how common these beliefs were in Greece or Rome.
I can only imagine that the church fathers must have felt that this belief somehow threatened their authority.
Well, they must have. I mean, as Christianity developed, its ideas in the first centuries, the ideas of the resurrection, which may also have had an empirical basis. It's been suggested that maybe the disciples saw an apparition of Jesus, and this gave them the idea of the resurrection.
I mean, you're inclined to think that many of these beliefs are based on actual experiences of one kind or another.
They may well have had, and then over time that became lost as the beliefs became more elaborated, and and then doctrine became more important. You lost the Gnostic, the direct experience element of it,
which was really threatening to the church.
It was, yes, it clearly was.
I know the conventional Catholic theology today sort of proclaims that one of their greatest triumphs was the eradication of Gnosticism.
Right. The idea of pre-existence, which is one Origen taught in particular.
Who was a church father.
He was one of the early church fathers, that's correct. But he was later declared anathema because he was talking about pre-existence. The pre-existence of the soul is different from reincarnation in that it doesn't posit a previous life. Origen was open to the possibility of reincarnation, but what he really was emphasizing was pre-existence, which is the idea that makes much less sense to me than reincarnation, but simply that the soul pre-exists the body, develops psychologically before a body is created, then comes into the body, lives only one life, and then spends an eternity after that. So it's just one among many ideas. So the pre-existence idea was out there, the reincarnation idea was out there, metempsychosis was out there. A variety of different ideas among many different teachers and groups and.
Well, I guess the main lesson we can draw from all of this is that the idea of reincarnation seems to have arisen independently in various ancient civilizations.
I think so, and that really makes sense because they all had. I mean, it makes sense if from our knowledge that reincarnation beliefs were very common in tribal societies, because all of these early civilizations developed out of the tribal populations at their basis, so that in the background of all of them there were animistic or shamanic beliefs. They lost more and more touch with the direct empirical basis, experiential basis of these things.
Dr. James Matlock, once again, a fascinating review of world culture and the role of reincarnation in many civilizations.
Well, thanks, Jeff.
Thanks for being with me.
I'm very glad to have been here.
Thank you for being with us.